It was supposed to be a quiet afternoon at Windsor, the kind of crisp, regal day where even the birds seemed to follow protocol. But then, something unusual happened. Queen Camilla, standing tall in her emerald coat, gave a direct command to one of the royal guards. Her words were clear, "You will salute me now." Moments later, his reaction, calm, firm, and utterly unexpected, left the entire palace whispering. What could make a guard, sworn to royal duty, defy a queen's demand in front of everyone? Before we uncover the shocking truth behind that moment, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and share this story with anyone who loves real royal drama. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Every salute, every silence, every stare at the palace tells a story, and this one might change how you see the royal guards forever. The morning light spilled softly over the walls of WindsorCastle, washing the stone towers in a golden hue. The air was brisk, tinged with that familiar British chill that always seemed to accompany royal mornings. The Union Jack fluttered proudly against the pale blue sky, signaling that the monarch was in residence. For most, it was just another day of ceremony and precision, the kind of day where tradition ruled every heartbeat. The guards stood tall at their posts, red tunics pressed perfection, rifles gleaming under the soft light. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply were, symbols of centuries-old discipline. Every salute, every step, every blink was trained time and rooted in loyalty. But this morning would be different. Queen Camilla had arrived earlier than usual. Her motorcade rolled into the courtyard in a quiet display of power, sleek, polished cars gliding across the cobblestones. When the door opened, she stepped out with her usual poise, dressed in deep emerald green and pearls that caught the light like droplets of rain. Her expression, as always, was carefully composed, regal, but with a touch of something sharper underneath. For a few moments, all was silent except for the faint hum of engines and the distant cry of a crow above the castle walls. Then came that voice, clipped, clear, and commanding. "Guards," she called, her tone leaving no room for hesitation. The line of guards remained still, their eyes fixed forward, their bodies unshaken. That was the rule. No movement, no acknowledgement, unless the command came through the proper channel. The Queen Consort, by royal code, did not command the salute directly. The salute was reserved for the reigning monarch, but perhaps Camilla wanted to test that boundary. She took a few steps closer, the sound of her heels echoing on the stone. The air grew tense. Courtiers nearby glanced at one another, uncertain whether to intervene. "Guardsmen," Camilla's voice rose again. "I believe a salute is in order." A few gasps escaped from the small cluster of palace aides nearby. She had said it clearly, not as a request, but as a demand, and her eyes landed squarely on one particular guard, standing just left of the main archway. His name was Sergeant William Kent, a veteran of the Household Division. He had served for 15 years, through the reign of Queen Elizabeth II and now under King Charles III. Kent was known among his peers as a quiet type, disciplined, respectful, and fiercely loyal to the late Queen. Many said he had cried privately on the day of her passing, though he never admitted it. And now, that same man found himself standing before Queen Camilla, her gaze sharp, her chin lifted, waiting for him to respond. Seconds passed like slow-moving clouds. The world seemed to hold its breath. "Sergeant," she said again, the hint of impatience creeping into her tone. "Do you not hear your queen?" A faint flicker crossed Kent's eyes. He did not speak, nor did he lower his gaze. But something in his posture shifted, barely noticeable, yet full of quiet defiance. And then, in a voice calm and steady, he finally replied, "Your Majesty, my orders are to salute the sovereign." The words cut through the air like a blade. For a moment no one moved. Even the pigeons perched along the battlements seemed to freeze mid-flutter. The courtiers exchanged uneasy glances, and one aide took a cautious step forward as if to smooth over the tension. But Camilla said nothing. Her eyes flickered, part surprise, part disbelief, as if she couldn't quite believe what she just heard. A guard refuting her. To anyone else, it might have seemed like a small exchange, a formality, a misunderstanding. But within the walls of Windsor, every gesture carried weight. Every word had meaning. Camilla's lips curved into something that was almost a smile, tight and controlled. "Very well," she murmured, turning away with practiced grace. "Protocol, then. Always protocol." Her tone was light, but her footsteps were brisk, her pearls swinging as she walked past the assembled aides. The tension she left behind, though, lingered like a shadow. Sergeant Kent stood unmoving, eyes straight ahead, as if nothing had happened. But behind that stoic exterior, his heart was pounding. He had not intended disrespect, only to follow the rules, the same ones he'd sworn to uphold. Yet something about the moment felt heavier, as if he'd just crossed an invisible line. Whispers soon rippled through the palace corridors. By mid-afternoon, the story had made its way from the courtyard to the private dining halls. The guard refused to salute Her Majesty. One maid whispered to another, "Imagine the nerve." But others saw it differently. "He followed the code," said a senior attendant quietly. Even the late queen would have respected that. As the sun dipped behind the castle walls, the moment began to take on a life of its own, twisted by whispers, shaped by opinion, and fueled by curiosity. By evening, even King Charles had reportedly been informed. He said little at first, only a slow exhale and a quiet, "Protocol exists for a reason." Those who knew him well said he looked thoughtful, even proud. Later that night, under the soft glow of the lanterns, Sergeant Kent remained on duty. The chill in the air had deepened, and the castle grounds were silent again. He stood where he always had, posture strong, rifle gleaming. And though no one dared speak of it aloud, every guard in that courtyard understood. Something rare had happened that day. A man in uniform had not defied, but honored, the crown in the only way he knew how. And somewhere deep inside Windsor's stone heart, an unspoken question began to echo. Was it defiance or dignity?
That night, the castle slept under a soft veil of mist. But inside the barracks, one man sat wide awake, his boots by the door, his cap folded neatly beside his bed. Sergeant William Kent wasn't thinking about his next shift. He was thinking about what had just happened, that single moment when his silence had spoken louder than any salute. He had never imagined himself standing at the center of royal gossip. Guards weren't meant to be remembered. They were meant to blend into the background, the steady heartbeat of tradition. And yet, tonight, he knew every corridor was buzzing with his name. Still, his conscience was clear. He hadn't broken the code. If anything, he had protected it. And to a soldier like William Kent, that meant everything. He reached for the small, worn photo resting beside his bunk. The edges were frayed, the colors faded, but the image still held its quiet power. Him, years younger, standing proudly beside the late Queen Elizabeth II after a ceremonial inspection. Her smile was gentle, warm, the kind that disarmed even the toughest of soldiers. He remembered that day vividly. The Queen had paused before him longer than expected. She had looked directly into his eyes and said softly, "Discipline isn't about obedience, Sergeant. It's about honor." Those words had lived in him ever since. He had carried them through every rain-soaked watch, every freezing dawn, every parade where his muscles ached from standing perfectly still. Honor, not pride. Loyalty, not flattery. That was the oath. And so, when Queen Camilla's voice had cut through the courtyard earlier that day, demanding a salute, those words came back like an echo from another time. He had not refused out of defiance, but out of respect for a line drawn by the very crown he served. Still, the thought of the moment replayed in his mind. The hush, the eyes, the ripple of shock that spread through the air. Could he have handled it differently? Maybe, but something deep inside him whispered that he had done what was right, and that whisper mattered more than the world's noise. By morning, the story had traveled far beyond Windsor's stone gates. A palace aide, perhaps too eager to impress, had whispered the tale to a journalist friend. By the time the first newspaper hit the stands, the headline blazed across the front page. Queen Camilla's command defied. Guard holds his ground at Windsor. The photograph beneath it showed Kent standing at his post, jaw set, eyes forward. No one could tell from the picture whether he was brave or foolish, and that perhaps was what made it so compelling. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some called him a hero. Others accused him of disrespect. But most, whether royal loyalists or not, couldn't help but admire the quiet dignity in the image. It was something ancient, something Britain hadn't seen in years. A reminder that even within the palace walls, principle still had a pulse. The following day, Kent was summoned to a private debrief. The officer in command, Colonel Harris, sat across from him, stern but not unkind. "Sergeant," he began, adjusting his gloves, "you've made quite the headline." Kent stood at attention. "Sir, my intention was never to draw attention." "I know," Harris replied, "but intentions rarely matter once the world starts watching." A long silence followed. Then the colonel leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I served under Her Late Majesty too, Kent. I remember her words, and I believe she'd have respected what you did. Still, we have to tread carefully. You've rattled more than a few nerves in the upper chambers." Kent nodded. "Understood, sir." "Good," said Harris. "Then stand tall. If anyone asks, you acted by the book. Because you did." That afternoon, the castle seemed to hum with tension. The courtiers walked a little faster, their conversations hushed. Even the tourists outside the gates could sense that something unusual was brewing behind the walls. Queen Camilla, to her credit, did not make a public comment. But those close to her said she was quietly displeased. Not furious, just unsettled. She was a woman who had fought hard for her place within the royal sphere, and the idea of being subtly challenged, even unintentionally, did not sit easily. Yet behind closed doors, King Charles took a different view. He summoned his private secretary and asked for the report himself. When it was read aloud, Charles reportedly paused, then let out a slow, almost wistful sigh. "Ah," he said finally. Elizabeth's words live on. No reprimand followed. No demotion. Just silence, the kind that speaks volumes. That evening, as the sky turned the color of pewter, Kent stood once again at his post. Tourists drifted by, their cameras clicking softly. A few looked at him longer than usual, perhaps wondering if he was that guard. He never flinched, never confirmed. The uniform, after all, was not about the man inside it. It was about what it represented. But one small moment did break his stillness. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, tugged on her mother's sleeve and pointed up at him. "Mummy," she whispered, "is he the one who didn't bow?" Her mother smiled gently. "Yes, love, but he didn't bow because he already stood tall." Something in Kent's chest tightened. Not pride, but quiet emotion. He didn't move, but for the briefest second, behind the shadow of his bearskin hat, the corners of his lips softened. By nightfall, the castle's lights dimmed once more. In the barracks, Kent sat again with a photograph of the late queen. Her words seemed to whisper from the paper itself. Honor, not obedience. Outside, the wind rustled through the courtyard. The same courtyard where he'd made his stand, unknowingly sparking a story that would ripple through the royal corridors and far beyond. And though he could not have known it yet, that single act of principle, that refusal to salute, was about to set in motion a chain of events that would shake the image of the monarchy in ways no one had foreseen. Because sometimes the smallest act of quiet loyalty can echo louder than 1,000 cheers. By dawn, the palace was a pressure cooker of silence. The polished corridors of Windsor were lined with familiar faces, aides, attendants, equerries, all moving with forced calm, pretending that nothing was unusual. But everyone knew something was. You could feel it in the air like static before a storm. Every newspaper on every silver breakfast tray carried the same image. Sergeant William Kent, motionless in his crimson tunic, beneath a headline that screamed "The Guard Who Wouldn't Bow." And for the first time in years, the story wasn't about scandal, wealth, or royal weddings. It was about honor. In the queen consort's private chambers, the soft clatter of porcelain echoed faintly. Camilla sat before her mirror, a silver brush gliding slowly through her hair. She said nothing for several minutes, though her lady-in-waiting could sense her tension, the stiffness in her shoulders, the faint tightness around her eyes. "Ma'am," the attendant began carefully, "the press are—" "I've seen," Camilla interrupted quietly. "Every paper, every word." The attendant hesitated, unsure whether to speak further. Camilla's gaze met hers in the mirror, composed, sharp, and yet faintly wounded. "I asked for respect," she said softly, "not rebellion." Of course, she hadn't meant to break protocol. It had been instinct, perhaps pride, perhaps a desire to remind those around her that she, too, held power. After all, for decades, Camilla had walked in the shadow of history. Now, standing beside a king, she refused to be overlooked. But the story had spun away from her control. The press wasn't painting her as the queen slighted. They were portraying her as the one who tested a loyal man's duty. And in Britain, few things drew sympathy like a soldier's discipline. At Buckingham Palace, King Charles sat with his advisors in the private audience room. The air was thick with cautious words. "Your Majesty," one senior advisor began, "the situation has become delicate. The public appears sympathetic to the guard." Charles raised an eyebrow. "Sympathetic? Yes, sir. Social media is flooded with praise. They're calling him the Silent Sentinel. There's even talk of a petition to commend his service." Charles leaned back his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Remarkable," he murmured. "The man merely followed the rule book, and the people treat it as rebellion." One of his secretaries spoke quietly. "Perhaps it's not the act itself, sir. Perhaps it's what it represents." The king's gaze lifted. "And what, pray, does it represent?" "Loyalty," the man replied simply, "to the memory of her late majesty." The room fell silent. Even Charles, usually calm and analytical, felt the weight of that truth. Elizabeth's shadow still stretched long across the monarchy, a legacy of dignity that no crown could replace overnight. And though Charles bore her heir's title, he knew the public's heart still belonged to his mother. For a fleeting moment, a smile ghosted across his lips. "Then perhaps this man has done us all a service," he said softly. "He's reminded the nation what that word still means." Across London, however, the debate was fierce. Television panels filled with royal commentators dissected every second of the exchange. Some claimed Kent had embarrassed the crown. Others said he had restored faith in it. "It's not defiance," one historian argued live on air. "It's a man upholding the rules that protect royal dignity." Ironically, he was more loyal than if he'd obeyed. Meanwhile, the tabloids churned with speculation. Had the queen consort confronted the guard privately? Had the king intervened? What happened next? But inside the palace, things were far less theatrical and far more human. Behind closed doors, Camilla's private secretary, Fiona Marsh, approached her with a thin file. "Ma'am," she said gently, "Sergeant Kent has been with the Household Division since 2008. Highly decorated. No record of misconduct." Camilla exhaled slowly. "Then he is not the problem." Fiona hesitated. "May I speak plainly, ma'am?" Camilla nodded. "It's not about him. It's about what the people see in him. They see a reflection of the late queen, restraint, steadiness, humility. And they miss that." For the first time that day, Camilla's eyes softened. "You think they don't see those things in me?" Fiona paused. "I think they're still learning to." Camilla turned away, her reflection flickering in the mirror's gold trim. Outside, a military band began playing faintly, the daily changing of the guard. The notes rose through the open window, distant but clear. For a moment, she watched them march, their boots striking the cobblestones in perfect rhythm. And something, perhaps pride, perhaps sorrow, crossed her face. By late afternoon, a new rumor began spreading among the palace staff. The king had asked for a private audience, not with ministers, not with advisors, but with Sergeant Kent himself. When the message reached the barracks, Kent thought it was a mistake. "An audience?" he repeated quietly. "With His Majesty?" The officer nodded. "You've stirred the hornet's nest, Sergeant. Best to let the king settle it." That night, Kent polished his boots until they gleamed, pressed his tunic crisp, and rehearsed every phrase of proper dress. His heart thudded quietly beneath his medals. He had no idea what awaited him: reprimand, dismissal, or something far more complicated. Back at the palace, Charles stood alone by the window, watching the lamps flicker across the courtyard. Elizabeth would have liked him. he murmured under his breath. Behind him, Camilla entered the room quietly. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she said softly, "You plan to see him?" "Yes," Charles replied. "I owe him that." Camilla's gaze lingered on him. "And what will you say?" The king turned, his expression unreadable. "I'll listen." The clock chimed 8. Somewhere deep in the castle, footsteps echoed faintly as a single guard made his way toward the king's chamber, unaware that the next few minutes would define not just his fate, but how a nation saw its monarchy. Because sometimes the most powerful stories in royal history don't begin with a crown, but with a salute that never came. The night air around Windsor was still and cool, the kind that wrapped the ancient castle in a cloak of quiet dignity. In the royal audience chamber, a single fire burned low in the hearth, its glow casting long, soft shadows across the room. The king stood near the window, his posture calm but thoughtful, hands clasped behind his back. A knock came at the door. "Enter," said Charles softly. The heavy door opened, and Sergeant William Kent stepped inside. His boots echoed against the marble floor as he crossed the room and stopped precisely 2 paces from the throne, spine straight, chin raised just enough to show respect, but never pride. He bowed once. "Your Majesty." Charles turned, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Sergeant Kent," he said quietly, "you've had quite the week." Kent didn't flinch. "So I've heard, sir." A faint smile tugged at the king's mouth, just enough to break the tension. "I imagine it's not the kind of fame a soldier seeks." "No, sir," Kent replied. "My duty is to serve, not to be seen." That answer seemed to please the king. He gestured toward a nearby chair. "Sit, if you will." Kent hesitated. "I prefer to stand, sir." Charles nodded. "As you wish. Old habits die hard, I suppose." For a moment, silence hung between them. Not uncomfortable, but deliberate. The kind of silence that allowed truth to breathe. Finally, the king spoke. "Tell me, Sergeant, why didn't you salute the Queen Consort?" Kent inhaled slowly, his eyes never wavering. "With respect, sir, I follow the code. A guard salutes the sovereign, and the sovereign only, unless ordered otherwise. My intent was not to offend Her Majesty, only to honor the rules set long before my time." Charles studied him for a moment, expression unreadable. Then quietly he asked, "And what did you feel in that moment?" Kent's answer came without hesitation. "Pride, sir. Not in myself, but in the uniform, in what it stands for. The late Queen, she taught us that our duty is bigger than any single person, even her." At that, Charles's gaze softened. He turned back toward the fire. "My mother did believe that," he murmured. "She used to say, 'The crown is not a person, it is a promise.'" The king paced slowly, the weight of memory in his stride. "You see, Sergeant, when one sits where I now sit, that promise can feel very heavy. And yet you, a man of no title, no privilege, carried it perfectly." Kent bowed his head slightly. "It is an honor, sir." Then came another voice, calm, familiar, and unmistakably royal. "Indeed it is." Kent turned. The door had opened quietly behind him, and Queen Camilla had entered, her expression poised but gentler than before. She wore no crown tonight, no jewels, just a soft evening gown of navy silk, her hair pinned neatly, her eyes steady on him. "Your Majesty," Kent said, bowing low. Camilla's voice was even, but not cold. "Sergeant Kent, I owe you clarity. When I asked for that salute, I spoke as a woman who has long fought to be seen in these walls, not as one who sought to bend the rules. I had forgotten, in that moment, that respect is earned, not demanded." Kent looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Ma'am, I meant no disrespect." "I know," she said quietly, "and that is why you will not be punished, but commended." The words hung in the air like a cord resolving after long tension. Even Charles's expression brightened with quiet relief. Camilla stepped closer, her tone softening. "I've spent years learning the language of this family, its silences, its traditions, its boundaries. Perhaps you reminded me that these walls are held together not by crowns, but by people like you." Kent stood frozen, uncertain what to say. His training had not prepared him for moments like this. Moments where humility and grace blurred the line between monarch and soldier. Charles stepped forward then, lifting a small velvet box from the table beside him. "Sergeant William Kent," he began formally, "for your unwavering service, your fidelity to duty, and your quiet defense of the standards that define this institution, it is my privilege to present you with the Royal Medal of Integrity." Kent's breath caught. He bowed deeply as the king placed the medal in his hand, small, shining, and heavier than it looked. "Thank you, sir," Kent said softly, "for understanding." Charles gave a small nod. "It is I who should thank you. Men like you remind us who we are and who we must remain." Outside, the first light of dawn began to touch the horizon, painting the castle walls in pale gold once again. By morning, word of the king's private commendation had spread quietly among palace staff, though no official statement was made. It didn't need to be. Sometimes in the royal family, silence is the statement. The tabloids tried to guess what had transpired, but none got it quite right. What they missed, what only those inside Windsor knew, was that something had shifted that night. Not just in the heart of a queen who had learned the meaning of humility, or a king reminded of his mother's wisdom, but in the spirit of a guard who had proven that loyalty isn't about obedience. It's about truth. That morning, as the new guard ceremony began, Sergeant Kent stood once more at his post. The sun glinted off the metal pinned discreetly beneath his tunic, hidden, but they're all the same. The courtyard filled with the rhythm of marching boots. Tourists gathered, cameras ready, unaware of the story that had unfolded just behind those doors. And then, as the queen consort stepped from her car to greet a visiting delegation, her gaze briefly found Kent among the line of guards. For half a heartbeat, something passed between them. Mutual respect, silent and unspoken. She did not command a salute this time. Instead, she offered the smallest of nods. And this time, Kent returned it. Two gestures, a nod, and an acknowledgement, quiet as the turning of a page. Yet in that exchange, centuries of protocol and pride found balance again. Later that day, in the quiet of the guards' quarters, Kent looked once more at the photograph of Queen Elizabeth II on his locker. He smiled faintly. "Honor, not obedience," he whispered. Outside, the bells of Windsor chimed the noon hour, their sound rolling across the courtyard, steady, timeless, and full of grace. And for all the world's noise within those ancient walls, the lesson of that week remained as simple as it was eternal. Respect can be commanded by power, but true honor must be earned.